everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the State of Psychedelic Investing. It's interesting. We haven't done a psychedelic event since last year. And in fact, when we did our first event, it was in New York City in January of 2020, when we were all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and so innocent and thought, wow, we're just going to have this little in-person event with no one wore masks, and it was a lot of fun. And then the world fell apart. So here we are again, and I feel like so much has changed in just a short amount of time since we had that event in the city. And I'm super excited to have my guests here. I have thanked them for taking time out of their very busy schedules to speak to you guys, our audience. So thank you for tuning in. What I'm going to do first is have each person introduce themselves and kind of give you, our audience, an idea of what's going on with them and their businesses, because like I said, constantly changing, and each company is doing so much every single month. So Simeon, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move around the break.
Sure. Thank you so much, Deborah, and great to be in the presence of two great companies. I'll start with an intro of where I'm at today. Basically, I'm a co-founding managing partner of JLS Fund. We are a plant medicine fund investing in early stage companies. But also to this topic and the opening, I've more or less been waiting 30 odd years for this moment in history. I was pretty fortunate as a young, curious teenager having the opportunity to study with Robert Masters and Gene Houston, who wrote, as I'm sure most of the audience knows, varieties of psychedelic experiences, which is still today, really a Bible for set and setting. And along those decades, I've been involved in, all aspects of the plant medicine community, have always appreciated the molecules and have always appreciated entrepreneurship and capital markets. So for me, I'm a bit of a kid in a candy shop sitting in this chair at this time in history. But yeah, in short, on the financing side, the VC side, advisory side for early stage psychedelic companies.
Great. Thank you, Simeon. And Josh Bartch is the CEO of Mydecine Innovations.
Sure. Thank you, Deborah, and happy to be with you all today. My name is Josh Bartch. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mydecine Innovations Group. So Mydecine Innovations Group is a company that's really focused on both first and second generation novel therapeutics revolving around the psychedelic molecules, and kind of taking the first generation as a blueprint and then making iterations and improvement upon those to create NCEs to really treat a number of indications, but more specifically, kind of our lead indications are PTSD and addiction. We have a very robust clinical trial infrastructure at various stages, ranging from a phase 2 PTSD study all the way through down to our preclinical work that we're doing on our novel molecules. Additionally, Mydecine has a very advanced telehealth platform, HIPAA-compliant telehealth platform focused around the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and overall mental health and well-being by the name of MindLeap that we're getting very excited to launch 2.0 coming in the very near future. So again, very, very great to be here today and excited to kick off this panel.
And last but not least, Ronan Levy. He is the CEO of Field Trip Health. Ronan, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be with Simeon and Josh on this panel. At Field Trip, we're focused on the end-to-end development and delivery of psychedelic therapies. What makes psychedelics so exciting and so unique and so challenging and so opportunistic in many ways is the focus of the experiential aspect of psychedelic medicine. So the molecules, the drugs play an incredibly important part, but also the setting, location, all of these terms that you'll become familiar with as you start to understand the psychedelic landscape more closely are very important to the therapeutic outcomes. At least that's where the evidence is. And so we are focused on building both ends of the spectrum. Through our Field Trip Health division, we're building out the physical infrastructure, the actual clinics to provide psychedelic-assisted therapy. Right now, working with ketamine-assisted therapy, but excited to be working with MDMA and psilocybin and any next-generation molecules as they come out. We have locations in Toronto, New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta. Houston is opening next week. We're opening in Amsterdam. We just announced San Diego, San Carlos, and a few more that I can't remember off the top of my head, but really focused on building the infrastructure and creating a best-in-class consideration for how psychedelic therapies should be delivered. On the other side of the equation, we have our field trip discovery division focused on developing the next generation of psychedelic molecules. Our first molecule in development is FT104. The basic thesis of FT104 is that psilocybin is an amazing drug and is going to revolutionize mental health in many ways, maybe even other aspects of healthcare, but focusing on mental health for now. But one of the big challenges around psilocybin is the fact that it's a very long experience. You know, you're kind of committed to a whole day in a clinical setting, which makes it expensive and clinically difficult to administer. So we asked the question, could you take all the wonderful aspects of psilocybin but shrink it down into a shorter time frame? And it turns out you could. So with FT104, we have something that's subjectively and objectively almost identical to psilocybin, but in a 2 to 3 hour experience as opposed to a 4 to 6 hour experience. So really, I think hitting the sweet spot in terms of not being too short to not be clinically significant and not being too long so as to not be too clinically difficult to administer. So we're very excited about that and expect and hope to be in phase 1 human trials by the end of this year and then beyond.
That's really neat. That is always an issue, the timing and the commitment to the experience. And congratulations on River Oaks. I'm originally from Texas. I used to live near River Oaks in Houston, and so it's a great neighborhood. I think our timing on having this discussion is really great, because last week there was big news out of MAPS with regards to MDMA and the FDA, and they had very good results on their PTSD. I feel like there's all these acronyms when I talk about this, but they did a study on PTSD, and they're getting close to phase 3. And as they just keep moving along, you know, it's looking more and more like the FDA is probably going to end up, you know, approving some form of MDMA for treatment for PTSD. And while some people may look at that and go, yeah, so it's a really big deal. This could really mean a lot for the treatment of PTSD, but also just this particular compound of MDMA. And Ronan, you mentioned it a little bit. So what do you guys, what was your reaction to that news?
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic for the industry as a whole. What you're seeing is, you know, public acceptance and really kind of a stake in the ground showing the efficaciousness of these various treatments. If you look at something like PTSD is something that we're very interested in. Our chief medical officer just retired in February after 31 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. Last 15 years, he was the chief of psychiatry for the Canadian Armed Forces, and obviously been involved in NATO for a number of years and been looking at kind of PTSD and alternative formats of treatment for PTSD. And really our advisory board is kind of stacked with the who's who in the PTSD realm. So something that a lot of people don't know is there's not a single drug that's actually manufactured specifically for PTSD. So everything is borrowed off label and utilized for PTSD very, in many cases, you know, obviously unsuccessfully. Maybe it works in 1/3 of the patient population, 1/3 of the time, right? So there's a huge white space and a huge need for improvement. And specifically in the veterans population, it's a huge underserved population with a massive amount of need for treatment. So for us, it's a huge win, not only for the potential patients that it could serve and hopefully, you know, help and improve and better their lives, but also, you know, to really kind of raise awareness around the psychedelic treatments in the industry as a whole, and really let people know that, you know, we're here to stay and that we're offering a much better and you know, safer treatment than what's currently available.
I was really amazed with the news that there was something like a 60% rate for people taking the MDMA, and after 3 sessions, they were basically diagnosed as not having that condition anymore, which, as you mentioned, with veterans or people that have suffered childhood trauma, to think that you could, you know, I don't want to say cured, but start to live an incredibly functional life after 3 sessions is just mind-blowing.
It's incredible. I mean, Deborah, when you and I first met, courtesy of Lewis at KCSA a couple
What,
of
like
years
2 or
ago,
3 years ago, we had lunch together. Like that
we had
seems
lunch, and I remember you were like interested, but you're skeptical as to like whether this is
very skeptical.
what is the thing. And this was kind of the moment that we've been building Field Trip for. I mean, it's really just the starting line, and it's not even the moment that we've been building it for. But it's a great validation of what we see, and I think it's a pivotal moment in terms of how we think about psychiatry, because we're showing now that psychiatry is a much more integrated thing, that it's not just about the neurochemistry, that what has been successful is not MDMA, it's MDMA assisted therapy, right? That's what's been working here. Now, maybe just MDMA on its own is relevant and would do a lot of good, but it's this integrated model that's truly showing the outcome. And that's why we're so focused on our integrated model with Field Trip as well, because those therapies, the set and setting, the preparation, the mindset, all of that is so fundamentally relevant. And in the context of clinical trials, you can't really innovate on that. You can't do a whole lot. You kind of overweight on therapy and all that kind of work because you want to make sure you're successful. At Field Trip, with the infrastructure we're building, we have the opportunity to really innovate on this kind of stuff and enhance it and find where the gaps in the market are. It seems like we're losing people left, right, and center sometimes on the flat panel. But it's incredibly exciting. It's a great validation, and it's really nice to be working with MAPS at Field Trip. They see us as I'm speaking for them. I shouldn't do that, but they see the scale we're trying to build as being pretty essential to the overall development of this industry. So they've been very good partners to us, and I like to think vice versa as well. So looking forward to building that evolution as things continue to progress.
Well, and I think you touched on something that was kind of what Josh was saying, where it's not just a matter of having the compound or the product. It's a dual situation, which is kind of what Mydecine is doing with the Mind Leap, with that assisted therapy along with it. So you're not just like the big pharma, like giving someone a pill and then saying, see ya, hope you get better. So I think that's, really interesting. It's also, Ronan, you bring up an interesting point that you and I had lunch a few years ago, and I was a bit skeptical. And you were really kind of early, as far as one of the people I was talking to about this industry. Although Simeon, you've been kind of involved in it for quite some time, but it's been in the headlines a whole lot over the last couple of years. And I think that the investment community maybe needs a reset, because it feels like people are looking at and hearing about psychedelics much like they heard about the cannabis industry. And in fact, Ronan, you have roots in the cannabis industry, but this is a much different layout and landscape for investors than the cannabis industry. And maybe Simeon, you can touch on that about, maybe resetting investor expectations for the psychedelic industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely want to acknowledge, one player in particular, MAPS. I remember, a decade or so ago, the beginnings of, phase 1 and a phase 1B from, hey, MDMA has this great efficacy, and if it's paired with the right psychotherapy and the right protocols, this can be a great healing initiative. So it's one of those feelings that you have, and you watch it, and you're checking in. And I've been reading the MAPS newsletter for I think 23 years now. Their bulletin, which is now the newsletter. So there's always been this, these seeds planted, and it was I think a combination of a perfect storm. The regulatory, all the great research that's coming out from a host of universities, and just exemplary chemists. And then, of course, the gist of this, which is the capital markets. It's those three factors that are allowing for this time in history, I think. As it relates to, the quality and the type of investing in this space, yeah, it's definitely not cannabis. It looks like it to some extent. I think with any nascent industry, and you see this in other ones, You get excitement, there's FOMO, you see a big opportunity, a huge market cap, and there's definitely some similarities, having ridden a few nascent industries from, the dot-com boom and bust at the turn of the century, to cannabis, where I operated my first dispensary in 2008. So watched, the rise of that, and then the market correction, and then the capital markets. Certainly the similarities behind capital being raised in Canada, which follows very closely to what happened in cannabis. That we're at a place right now where the investor, the funds, the companies need to really understand that this is going to be, for the most part, regulatory. It's going to be paired with clinics. It's going to be paired with psychotherapy. It might be, as Josh shared, with Mind Leap. There's this whole other, bucket of trans tech, wearables, apps, brain sensing devices, AI, ML, etc. But to answer your question, yeah, it's not cannabis. It feels like it. It sounds like it. But it's a very, very different industry. And, personally, when I'm on the phone with someone, the FDA or the DEA, whenever I had those conversations in the past around cannabis, it was a lot of pushback, like, and it's startling and it's revelatory, and it's pretty amazing that there's in full support, because people are, one, seeing the shift in the zeitgeist, but two, reading the research. And all of a sudden, instead of, hey, yeah, it's scheduled, or there's stigma, or there's a past to it, but the data is indisputable, much to the, initial point of, MAPS finally getting to this point after a very long period, with other medicines and other companies and for-profits and nonprofits and PBCs all across the board, adding value to this space, if you will.
Well, I think some investors, like with cannabis, there was money to be made, and quickly. There was a quick turnaround. A lot of people felt like they could get into companies and have pretty quick exits, and not everybody made a ton of money, but it was a fairly straightforward effort. Here we're dealing with biotech companies that are having to do various levels of testing and studies, and getting people for the studies. And especially with COVID, I know there were plenty of companies that wanted to do drug studies, but getting the volunteers to step up for those studies was really hard, because you couldn't do stuff in person. That seems to be really changing pretty quickly. I feel like we're starting to see studies popping up right and left that are actually getting populated with subjects to volunteer for these services. But I think those investors have to understand that this is not a quick play. This is more of a long-term investment.
I think people in the psychedelic industry are too quick to distinguish it from cannabis. There's a couple of things I'd like to say, which is there are some similarities, but I think the psychedelic investing opportunity is much larger than cannabis, because when you're talking about the psychedelic opportunity, you're actually talking about the majority of the mental health treatment market. I fundamentally believe we're going to fundamentally shift a lot of how we deal with mental health indications without question. And there's, we're talking about depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders. Psychedelics are now being looked at for migraines and neurodegenerative, anything pertaining to the brain and potentially beyond. Psychedelics seem to have an opportunity. So it's a much bigger market. But one of the similarities, just to challenge your point, Debra, is that there's Oregon now creating the first market for psilocybin services, which is a cultivation and therapy market. You have California looking at that. You have Florida. You have the state of Maine. You have Hawaii. And that's just after 1 year from Oregon approving it. Inevitably in 2022 and 2024, it's going to be a lot more states creating non-FDA markets for access to psilocybin. So even though I think psychedelics are much... I'm losing my signal now.
No, you came back.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that pure biotech market, which is actually really exciting because there's the long-term play, which is purely medical, synthetic, and indication based, and then there's the potentially a much more short-term, still very interesting opportunity, with a much broader thing. Because one of the unfortunate aspects of the purely medical approach is that you're only treating people who are sick, right? But psychedelics, at least the evidence seems to suggest, have profound implications for more people. Probably the majority of the population can benefit to some degree from psychedelic therapies, but if you don't fit into the box of being depressed or anxious or having PTSD, you're going to be excluded from the medical approach. So it's really nice to see these complementary models of, in cannabis, you had recreational and medical. Here it's probably more medical in a purely medical sense, and a wellness, which is, I don't think this is a dispensary take-home kind of model. I think it's a brick and mortars in-person experience kind of model, but they're very complementary, and it means that we can reach more people, and it actually means the business opportunity is much more textured and I think robust.
Right. I think if you could call it, the recreational psychedelic market is much smaller than the cannabis one. It's also been interesting with the psychedelic business side, that the stocks, having seen the cannabis stocks, when I first started covering cannabis back in like 2013, there was a lot of kind of shady, dodgy pot stocks, we like to call them, that would just put cannabis somewhere in the name of the company title. And they probably had little to do with cannabis, but they had cannabis somewhere in their title, and the stock would run up because people were buying this thinking, oh, I'm buying a cannabis stock. And then most of those stocks actually don't even exist today, or they're like, half of a penny. I feel like I'm seeing a little bit of that starting to happen now, not so much with the earlier psychedelic companies, but I feel like I'm starting to see that more across my inbox, where I'm seeing lots of clinic companies. And I'm sure this makes you crazy, Ronan, because you've done such an amazing job of creating such a quality clinic company. And then I would say, even with Josh, I feel like there's all these companies now just putting some kind of variant form of the word mushroom or mycos or something like that into their company title. And then, when you dig a little deeper, you're like, this company has literally nothing to do with this. They're just throwing the name in. How are investors able to, new investors, how are they able to separate the real from the copycats?
It's a very good question, and actually I think Simeon may have a lot more insight into it, because he probably sees a lot more decks and considers them a lot more carefully than I do. But I think it just comes down to the fundamental questions of, do you understand the business model? Is it coherent? Is it a team that has experience, that has executed before, and don't just take the face value of what people put in the deck, but ask questions and go a little bit deeper? And I think you can quickly distinguish the credible players from the non-credible players. By and large, most of the companies I've seen so far are credible, to varying degrees of credibility, but I don't feel like they're shady or just in it for a quick turn, which gives me some comfort. And I truly believe right now it's a situation where a rising tide floats all boats, that we're just about to publish some survey results, which most people have no idea that psychedelics can be used in a therapeutic context, even though to us, we probably think about everybody knowing it. It's really actually a very small community. So as long as they're credible players doing decent or good work, I think it's a net positive. So it actually doesn't drive me crazy yet. But again, I haven't seen too many of the less credible things.
Well, you'll see. It's starting to get where just about every product out there has got, you're now getting a variant form where there's mushrooms in it. It's mushroom this, mushroom that, mushroom this, mushroom that. It's like, oh, please. But Simeon, what do you have?
Yeah, no, on that last point, I think, if you look at the molecules being able to, this is a generalization, but cure sickness or optimize wellness, in that later bucket, you're seeing a ton of functional mushroom companies, that are riding the wave of an Amanita, a psilocybe, a Jedi Mindfuck, an albino, because those might be getting press, but their intention is not necessarily to pivot into psychedelic mushrooms. But Chinese medicine, functional mushrooms is a a huge market in its own right. So you'll see people, use in their press release kind of an homage to what's happening in a hot industry, if you will. That being said, we've diligenced several hundred companies, and I'm actually really pleased. I am not seeing as many sector chasers as you'd think. I'm seeing really high quality, high caliber companies coming together. I think if you look at cannabis, where there was that blockchain, although that goes back and forth. I mean, I was up with Dogecoin, now I'm down. That aside, the general stuff we're seeing from those who do get funded, have a very strong team, which is where we always start. It's always about the team. Are really innovating. I'm seeing 1 in 100 that are that press release where there's nothing behind it. And maybe that's just the ones coming to us, but I think our radar is pretty developed. And I've been, really surprised that there's not a lot more quote unquote sector chasers. And you see that in any nascent industry. So that's just my view from it, that generally the quality is good. And yes, people will try to get on the train, as they will in any industry. But there's a lot of people who've been waiting, a lot of people with transferable accomplishments, a lot of people who have skill sets that can begin to form a company, who understand biotech, who understand regulatory, who understand cultural zeitgeist, and found a company that, is much like, the people on this panel. And I'm
Maybe
just
they're
not
all coming to my inbox, and
maybe.
And that may be because I'm media. It may be that I'm getting a lot of the fly-by-nights versus people that are serious, that are asking for money or looking for investors. Then you're seeing the more serious. I'm seeing a lot of wannabes, or people that just, like I said, just stick mushroom in the name. So with these, we've mentioned different things. Ronan, I know at your clinics you do ketamine. We've talked about MDMA. We've talked briefly about psilocybin. With all those different, we've got this umbrella of roof of psychedelic, that term psychedelic, but there's so many different products within, and product maybe isn't the best word, but medicines within that umbrella of psychedelics. What do you guys think as far as what's going to be the breakout here, or the leader? I mean, right now ketamine has been, because it was already kind of approved, and an easy on ramp to this. But do you think that the ketamine might get pushed aside ultimately for psilocybin, or is MDMA going to find a home, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we started with ketamine like most because it's legal and available now. And initially our viewpoint was always, it's just a stepping stone. It's just a stopgap until we can work with psilocybin or MDMA. What we're seeing is that ketamine is profoundly effective for a lot of people. And so my thinking around it has shifted to it just being one of a tool belt. You don't, if you were a medical cannabis patient, you didn't go from doing nothing to, a headbanger strain, right? Like, and going to the highest volumes, you worked your way up to find what worked, right? And so if we just take a lens from the underground therapy market, which is actually how I think the above ground is going to evolve as that wellness and the medical kind of start to converge, is people are going to triage. You may start with ketamine-assisted therapy because it's an easy stepping stone for someone who's dealing maybe with not the most severe forms of depression, but wants to do something beyond antidepressants or just conventional therapy. And then, depending on your progress there, you may move up to psilocybin. But as obviously we work with a lot of psychiatrists in our clinics who have a pretty deep understanding of psychedelics, what we find is, well, yeah, you're dealing with depression, so psilocybin is indicated, but underlying your depression is a lot of trauma. So even though it may be an off-label use of MDMA, it makes sense for you to make MDMA a part of your overall long-term healing plan, right? And so is there going to be one breakout? Probably. That's why we're so excited about FT104, because it has all the qualities of breakout in terms of positive subjective experience, accessibility in terms of cost and administration, and we expect really great outcomes comparable with just a lower cost and lower bar to entry. But I think there's going to be a robust market for all of these. If there's evidence, if they're safe, if there's utility, then doctors will use them, and our doctors would use them. And we have a pretty good lens on what the attitude from the psychiatrist community, who's already open-minded to psychedelics, thinks, and that seems to be the consensus right now.
And Josh, I know you're having connectivity problems, but now that we've got you, we're talking about what we think might be the breakout compound within this umbrella of psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, sure. I think it's yet to be seen. I think something unique about kind of the second generations of psychedelic drugs is that we have an incredible starting point, right? We're not shooting in the dark. Generally speaking, when you look at traditional drug development on novel compounds, they're screening thousands of compounds with the hope to get a couple hits, and then they're starting basically shooting in the dark from scratch, which is why you see inflated prices on drug development traditionally, right? So in this specific industry, we're starting from incredible data over, from the 1950s, 1960s, and obviously, resurging now, that we have a great starting point. And then we can make iterations on improving problems that we know, things like stability, which is a huge issue with both psilocin and psilocybin. But also, obviously, Ronan addressed half-life, and that's something that us at Mydecine have also really, successfully tackled and looked at. How do you make it much more scalable, for one, and much more applicable to traditional therapy, right? So as far as a specific substance, I don't know. I think that there's room for a number of different, base molecules to have improvements upon, all kind of serve different purposes for different indications. But definitely, the second generation taking, nature's design or traditional design and then making, vast improvements and kind of putting a pharmaceutical lens on it, but also looking at how do we make this more scalable, from a business standpoint, more profitable, but also from the patient's perspective, how do we make something that can serve large patient populations and isn't limited by, kind of limited to the design of the traditional molecule as it pertains to long-term half-lives, also, a significant amount of psychotherapy protocols associated with a single treatment. So all of those things are being addressed, I think, by, companies like myself, and obviously Field Trip is working on, similar compounds, et cetera. So, what's going to win? I don't know. But I do know that there will be, first generation treatments that are already vastly better than what's currently available. And the second generations will be improvements upon that. And I think over time, you'll continue to see, improvements, et cetera. So it's really exciting for both people struggling and then also for the investment community as a whole.
And you bring up an interesting point about the molecules, in the sense that I know we often just say psilocybin, but, the more you start to dig into this, you realize that there are numerous versions of mushrooms that produce psilocybin. There's not just one, it's not just, indica or sativa. There's dozens of different mushrooms that produce a version of psilocybin. Do you think that we're going to start to see intellectual property battles, genetic battles, things of that nature? Are we going to see competition with companies where they're cultivating a specific type of mushroom that might address obesity or addiction, but and then now they kind of own that, but it starts to get really complicated because as you mentioned, Josh, you're dealing with a natural product that
Yeah, I think from an IP standpoint, well, there's a couple of things here. So I think from an IP standpoint, it's impossible to patent a product of nature, right? So we'll start there. Also from, specific genetics that are tailored towards specific things, from an FDA, Health Canada, really the global equivalence of that, it's very hard to look at utilizing a whole mushroom or a whole mushroom extract towards getting an FDA approval, right? They don't like variabilities at all. It needs to be standardized. Now, if that's better for something, maybe it is, but from the FDA perspective, you need to really isolate those compounds, bring it down, understand what they do individually, and then maybe make, specific formulations and move that through the pipeline. Something that we've been doing at Mydecine over the last 12 months is dissecting up at the University of Alberta a number of these different varietals, right, that we've been able to obtain from various sources. And what we're finding is exactly what we thought, right? Which is there's much more going on within these mushrooms than just psilocybin or psilocin. We've identified over 40 compounds that are active in various formats of mushrooms specifically. So like you said, I mean, there's over 200 known varietals of mushrooms that contain psilocybin and psilocin, probably vastly more than that we don't know, that are undiscovered. But that's a huge starting point and a huge library. Anecdotally in shamanistic practices for a long, long time, you look at what they've been using for, mushrooms, right? They have different mushrooms used for very specific things, which obviously tells you that there's much more going on than just the psilocybin or psilocin compound. There's interactions with other molecules, analogs, tryptamines, whatever it might be, that's causing some sort of different effect. So, we're understanding that, we're classifying these individual molecules and trying to, understand the overall entourage effect, if you will. But I think ultimately what those, hold promise for, again, is another starting point, and starting to understand what they do, and then look at better ways to make those more applicable in the FDA's lens, as well as the treatments and the therapy lens.
Right. When you bring up the FDA, certainly standardization is, and cleanliness is the biggest deal for them. That these products are created in a lab that's clean. We obviously saw that recently with COVID and the vaccine in the one company that had a batch go bad. So it with ketamine and MDMA, those are that ship has kind of sailed on the ability to replicate and standardize a product. But when you come to mushrooms, and it's a fungus, and they in the natural world, they're often grow off of trees that have been laying on the bottom of the woods, or dare we say it, animal poop, out of manure. Those aren't very clean. So what is going on with, I guess, the cultivation of, like the clinical cultivation of mushrooms?
Sure. So I think, something that you can relate this to would be a GW Pharmaceuticals, right? That took a natural product and was able to standardize it. Mushrooms and fungi are much easier to standardize from a cultivation perspective. So, with that being said, you still need the platform or area, and it has to be a CGMP, licensed facility. So obviously that entails a number of very advanced SOPs, specific SOPs, security measures, and then cleanliness is a massive thing, and then being able to reproduce those molecules. And the genetics is something that, you can use biosynthesis methods, you could use traditional cultivation methods. So there's a number of ways to tackle it. But ultimately the end product, when you run it through different extraction purification methods, you're able to get a very refined product regardless of what the starting point is, right? So that's basically what kind of our perspective is on it. We're also looking, our geneticist, Rob Roscoe, our CSO, has a long history. He was the first person in cannabis to use CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology on the cannabis plant. Obviously was very successful in isolating different compounds in the cannabis plant. So we're looking at the same thing in psilocybin and psilocin producing mushrooms. So anyways, needless to say, there's a lot still to be tackled, but I don't think it's insurmountable by any means.
Interesting. Simeon, have you seen any kind of decks come across your plate dealing with this type of thing, or focusing on this?
Yeah, very, very much so. And as a closet mycologist for a while, it's fascinating when you have a spore, a tissue culture, and you choose your substrate and your spawn base, and you apply different technologies, whether it's AI nebulizers or ML that's taking 1,000 pictures a second, as well as analyzing the pH balance of the underlying substrate. So there's an immense amount of very, very interesting mycology cultivation things happening, and have been happening for a while. I think back to your question on breakouts, though. I mean, nobody knows, no one could portend the future, but it feels like, let's say generation one, your classical psychedelics, your LSDs, your psilocybins, your iboga, et cetera. Then there's maybe a gen 2, which I'd put like a 5-MeO and a Gen 2, not because it hasn't been around, but, a Bufo or anything Alvarius has not been around in practice. There's no tie to a Bufo to an indigenous community that goes back 5,000 years. And there's still a great opportunity to really understand the right protocol, potentially IP on that. And then I think the biggest one, which are going to be some of the biggest breakouts, are kind of like this third generation, everybody working on a new compound entity. And, when I visit universities or I visit labs and talk to chemists who are like, hey, I'm going to make a better X, Y, or Z. I think the funding's coming into the NCE space. I think science is looking at that. And then the fourth generation, which really isn't fourth generation, but you're starting to see this a lot. And it's really exciting. It gets into bioethics, but brain-computer interfaces, AI, precision medicine, where the medicine I would need might be very different than what you would need. But the amount of AI and ML just to scan a person and say, hey, you should try A, B, or C, whether it's paired with a psychotherapeutic protocol or not, I think is going to happen a lot faster than everybody thinks. And that might be the breakout. Yeah.
Wow. That's going to make things kind of interesting for you, Ronan, in your clinics, if you're going to have so much intense tech for your patients. I mean, I have read about the thing that reads the brain. But wow, that it is really, it just blows your mind about how we feel like we've just started to scratch the surface on, to your point, Josh, about all these various compounds that we're just now getting to study in very specific formats. And then to your point, Simeon, with all this tech that's also kind of getting wrapped into it. I mean, it's just crazy how, like you said, I feel like maybe we thought we were further along, but maybe we're only in the first or second inning of this industry.
I think that's a fair assessment. I like to say we're still in the batter's box, to use the baseball analogy. But one of the things that I think the AI and ML is extremely interesting and will involve precision medicine. But I think one of the things we'll also see here is that
and maybe let's just reset that AI is artificial intelligence and ML is
machine learning.
I just wanted to make sure in case anybody was going, what? Go ahead.
The thing that's interesting, though, is that as we go more and more to integrative medicine approaches, being proactive, my hope is a lot of this will not be acute medicine of like severe depression. There will be definitely a need for that, but I think more and more people are going to become aware that this is a proactive effort, right? So it won't just about being the drug for Simeon's brain, here's the perfect one, bam, he has no more depression. There's still going to be, and I think this is going to be the more robust parts in the future of people who are like on an active journey, doing this because it makes them better. It's not because I need my depression, but I want a more holistic, robust, well-considered, happier life. And that's where the experiential, this is where the wellness and the medical starts to overlap. And I think it starts to look different. And so in that context, I think there is going to be some breakouts because there are certain experiences that people are going to want more than just, my depression is now cured. And that's what, again, this is why I find it so interesting. It's not drug cures condition. It's not an antibiotic that gets rid of my infection. This is very much a human experience and a human journey that's overlapping with medicine. And I don't have the answer. Maybe it looks like conventional medicine. Maybe I'm totally wrong on this, but my instinct says that it's going to be much more textured than we understand medicine to be.
Yeah.
Cool. I want our audience to start to think about questions you may have, and we will be. Actually, we have some questions. So you know what? I'm going to go on and go to the questions now. I was going to ask you guys what your advice would be for a new investor, but let's go to the questions and then we'll wrap up with that. We got question, is Big Pharma a partner or a competitor in the development of this market? Well, that's a good question.
I think eventually Big Pharma will be a partner. Right now, they're looking, besides obviously Spravato, et cetera, but as far as the other well-known psychedelics, they're definitely paying attention, I would imagine. What we're starting to see is kind of an influx of human capital, I think, from Big Pharma first is kind of a phase one. You look, for instance, Mydecine, our company, just elected a president of European operations, Michel Rodolphe, who was the CEO of Novartis Norway for 4 years, was an executive level management at Novartis for 14 years. And you're starting to see kind of that high level individual, both from the FDA as well as Big Pharma, really, garner an interest and enter into the space, as well as you're starting to see, big blue chip biopharma money start to feed in as well. So I think it's inevitable that they're going to enter the space. Joint ventures make sense for them, right? Or acquisition. So it's yet to be seen what that strategic partnership or acquisition is going to look like as Big Pharma, but I think it's inevitable for sure.
Yeah, just bringing the lens forward from the cannabis industry, where it felt like Big Pharma was very much on the sidelines, watching and waiting. I know they did make some steps with investments and partnerships with Tilray and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it feels like big pharmaceuticals, maybe not the biggest, but some of the biggest. We saw it with Otsuka investing in Compass Pathways, for example. We know that there's a lot of interest. Even we've had from pharmaceutical companies that are interested in watching the space develop in a much more active way than they saw the cannabis industry develop. So it does seem inevitable, but I think there's going to be a very, like I said, many varieties of how this market emerges, from the medical to the wellness.
And who knows, we may start to see, acquisitions when we saw like Jazz buying GW Pharmaceuticals. We have seen some of the big pharma stepping in and buying some of these companies. We have a question for Josh. What's the next step in line for Mydecine moving forward?
So the next step in moving forward for Mydecine is continuing on our clinical infrastructure. We also are getting ready to announce a very high-level partnership on a late-stage clinical that we're incredibly excited about. Mydecine takes a phased approach. So we look at it, like I said, in generations, right? So generation one is single molecule of psilocybin for an specific addiction, as well as our PTSD. We look to push that through to FDA approval, and then during that time, an exclusivity period, we'll be introducing our more novel, improved approaches. And that's something that's going to continue in a cycle over, endless amounts of years, hopefully, into the future. So, the next steps for Mydecine is, again, to continue along our path to really push our clinicals forward and push our drug development pipeline forward as well.
And we had someone ask about stock tickers, but I just went on and gave like the Mydecine stock ticker, and then the field trip, I'll put that also. I put it in the chat, but I'll put it also in the question level as well. Not that we are stock promoting, because we don't do that. But I certainly want people to know how to find your companies, unless Simeon wants to do that, but my guess is you're not gonna.
No, and maybe on that point too.
I'm sure you get that. I get that all the time. People are always.
Oh no, of course. There's the great uncle who a decade ago, accused me of being a drug dealer, and now says, "Hey, I just read this thing in the Post. You're helping vets with PTSD. Congratulations, I'm really proud. Hey, what stock should I buy?" Things like that. But I never publicly, because of disclosure reasons, say that. But I'm reflecting on a point Ronan had that kind of dovetails into stocks in general. Like the metaphor I've used is the marathon one, and it doesn't even feel like the first mile. It feels like having myself personally run a few marathons, that was over 100 pounds ago. It feels like we're 7 months before deciding to train. You're eating a big bag of Doritos. It's so early. So even with, some of I think the early companies that are already there in public continue to thrive, but I think there'll be a whole mess of really exceptional companies and a lot of fun M&A in this space.
And there is actually a Horizons ETF now. They have a psychedelic ETF, HPSYF, and sometimes that's a lot of times what I will tell new investors is maybe you start with an ETF versus trying to stock pick, just so that you can kind of take your time to learn about the companies. and learn the differences between them. That's something that I think is a good place to suggest for new investors. We did have a new question. Given the legalization landscape in the States, where do you see the best pathway to preemptively situate a clinic/coaching practice to be poised, yet toe the line with legality concerns? So if somebody's looking at trying to get into like maybe assisted therapy or coaching, what's the best state, I guess, to maybe start to do that where it's least risky?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to get involved with psychedelic assisted therapy is find someone or work with ketamine, right? That's legal everywhere and anywhere. There are some restrictions in state by state in terms of who you can treat and what forms you can use, but that's available and accessible now, and we're seeing really, really wonderful results in our clinics. If you're focused only on the classic psychedelics, then Oregon is the state to be in, because even though it seems likely that you'll see California and Florida and Maine do something, it's still very unknown and the likelihood low, but Oregon's already passed Measure 109. So it's not about whether, it's just, how it gets implemented and what's it look like. So definitely Oregon is the place to be to get started.
Yeah, that's kind of it could be a whole new subset of assisted therapy, is people that just strictly specialize in this type of thing, because certainly a traditional therapist who's handing out prescriptions for Xanax is a very different approach to a person needing help versus being with someone, as you mentioned, Ronan, on a potentially 4 to 6 hour experience. I mean, that's a very different type of approach, and you would need a very different type of person addressing that or wanting to get into that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big conversation points is training. How do you have enough qualified therapists to understand the psychedelic experience and can support people? Because it is, I mean, I think any therapist who's good at their job and very empathetic naturally creates containers of safety. So the basic skill set exists, I think, amongst most therapists, but to be truly qualified to lead people through very intense, potentially very vulnerable and very emotional experiences, you want someone who knows what they're doing. So I know that's one issue they're, I won't say struggling with, but it's a very important topic of conversation in the state of Oregon. Is on day one of the legal market, how do you ensure enough qualified people are out there? Because as safe and effective as psychedelics are showing themselves to be, they're not entirely risk-free. People still have challenging experiences, and if not supported properly, can become bad experiences. And so it's important that the proper container be provided.
And Josh, I'm sure with the telemedicine that you guys are creating, is that certainly an area of challenge of getting the right people for that?
Yeah, so absolutely. And something that's important to note about what MindLeap does. MindLeap does not look to administer the actual psychedelic experience remotely. I think that is something that needs to be one-on-one human interaction, where you have somebody physically present with you, monitoring you, walking you through it, right? So there's no mistaking that at least in the current state of the drugs effects, that's something that is irreplaceable, right? So, we're looking to facilitate the interactions that don't actually have any substances taken, right? So the psychotherapy protocols outside of the actual physical experience. With that being said, we take it very seriously on who we let on the actual application as a qualified psychotherapist or therapist, et cetera. And that really comes down to what is their history, what is their training protocols, obviously what is their educational background as well. But you look at some things like MAPS, right? MAPS has a pretty stringent and pointed protocol that people need to go through and get qualified and have that kind of MAPS stamp of approval. I think there's going to be a lot of still yet unforeseen, and it's unknown what is the best protocols, and specifically what is the best protocols per specific indications, right? I don't think it's a one size fits all. where you just have psychotherapy with psychedelics. I think it needs to be very pointed protocol with very pointed intentions. And I think that also needs to be specific backgrounds of expertise that's specifically treating a single indication, right? So, and as you move on, that's going to be better well known what's working for what. And that also goes, along with the drug too, on as it pertains to time course and indication, severity of indication. If it's something like veterans that are historically speaking much more treatment resistant to formats of treatment, maybe you need an 8-hour experience or multiple treatments when somebody, also suffering from PTSD from a different derivative could, maybe benefit from something shorter, et cetera. So a lot of this is there's more questions than answers, but, hopefully over the near term and moderate term, we'll be able to answer a lot of this with the more data and more experiences that I've had, right?
Okay, so we're winding down on time. We certainly have the breakout lounge afterwards if anyone wants to join. If there's any last questions, great. Otherwise, I'm curious to ask the gentlemen. I've had my vaccinations. I'm starting to, get out and about a little. I went to my first in-person cannabis event last week. Are you guys putting stuff on the calendar? Are there any events that you are planning on attending in the next 6 months?
I'm in Canada. I've only had one vaccine. I'm not fully vaccinated. It'll probably be another 6 years before I get my second one.
That's what I hear. I hear it's not good in Canada getting these shots.
Well, we're getting better, but I'm not planning anything until I have certainty on when I get fully vaccinated. But,
all right, if we want to see Ronan, we gotta cross the border.
Yeah.
I got on my first plane about a week ago. I'm here in the Southwest looking at a project, and I'm considering, after having COVID twice somehow, but then getting my second Pfizer shot about a month ago, I'm feeling very comfortable personally starting to attend safe events. So there's, I guess we'll see. But all the very popular one that I've been going to for about 14 years, crossing fingers, Horizons is one of my favorite conferences. So definitely going to that. And as things pop up and travel allows, we'll hopefully start seeing people face to face again.
Yeah, absolutely. You're starting to see things, starting to see things open up, and it's a breath of fresh air. And obviously, I actually haven't been vaccinated quite yet. I will be in the near term. I have been traveling throughout the COVID pandemic, and luckily, knock on wood, I haven't actually come down with COVID once. So twice is, I apologize. That's bad luck, to say the least. But needless to say, I think that we're all very pent up and incredibly excited for human interactions, and a lot of relationships we've kind of cultivated, both in my company as well as outside with fellow colleagues in the industry, have been virtual. And it's something that has been an experience. And, I've cultivated friendships with individuals that I've never met in person, which is unique. But I can't tell you how excited I am to actually meet a number of people in person and regain that human interaction, which is just, again, irreplaceable, right? So
it really is.
Something we're definitely looking forward to.
It is. So we're going to go on and end the session there. I know that, Ronan, you told us about all the new locations you've got coming up. And Josh, you told us about the things you've got coming up. I don't know, Simeon, did you have anything you want to say that you're super excited about?
No, it's meeting you for a meal at some point in New York in the near future. That's the most exciting thing for me.
I tell you, I am ready to start setting those things up. I will very much look forward to that. So I'm going to go on and end the session here. Once again, thank you, gentlemen, so much. Thank you to our audience for listening. We're going to have this recorded and put in our YouTube channel. And I may see some of you in the lounge afterwards. Bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Thanks, guys.